Buenos Aires, 1905. The port is chaos. A massive steamship from Genoa has just docked, and down the gangplank come hundreds of Italians. Men in worn suits carrying cardboard suitcases. Women in dark dresses holding children's hands. They speak no Spanish. They've never been outside their villages in Calabria, in Sicily, in Campania. They have no idea what Argentina even looks like. They only know what the recruiters told them. There's land, there's work, there's a future. Giuseppe Moretti, 23 years old, steps onto Argentine soil for the first time. In his pocket, he has an address for a boarding house in a neighbourhood called La Boca, where other Sicilians have settled. He has 12 pesos that his mother sewed into the lining of his jacket. He can't read or write, but he can work, and that's why he's here. Giuseppe has no way of knowing that he and 2 million other Italians like him are about to change Argentina forever. That their children will speak Spanish instead of Italian. That their grandchildren will think of themselves as Argentine, not Italian. That their great-great-grandchildren, living in Buenos Aires in the year 2025, will take a DNA test and discover something shocking. They're not Spanish at all, despite speaking Spanish their entire lives. They're 65% Italian, carrying Giuseppe's genes, completely unaware that their family came from a village in Sicily rather than from Spain. This is the story of how Argentina became the most European country in Latin America by accident. How a nation trying to attract Spanish immigrants got Italian ones instead. How millions of people like Giuseppe crossed an ocean, learned a new language, built a new country, and in the process created one of the strangest genetic outcomes in the Americas. Argentina today is 85 to 90% European genetically, but the majority of that European DNA doesn't come from Spain, the colonial power that gave Argentina its language and institutions. It comes from Italy, from millions of immigrants who arrived between 1880 and 1930 and genetically transformed the country. This is the story written in Argentinian DNA, and it starts long before Giuseppe and his fellow Italians arrived. Before we can understand how Argentina became European, we need to understand who lived there first, and why that matters for the genetic story. When Europeans first arrived in what is now Argentina in the early 1500s, they didn't find the massive empires that existed in Mexico or Peru. There was no Argentinian equivalent of Tenochtitlan or Cusco. Instead, they found a mosaic of indigenous peoples spread across an enormous territory, from the subtropical forests of the northeast to the windswept plains of Patagonia. In the northwest, near what is now the border with Bolivia, lived peoples influenced by the Incan Empire. The Diaguita, the Calchaquí, populations who practiced agriculture, built irrigation systems, and lived in permanent settlements. When the Spanish arrived, these were the most densely populated regions of what would become Argentina. Across the vast pampas, the great grasslands of central Argentina, lived nomadic peoples like the Guaraní and the Puelche. They were hunter-gatherers who followed the herds across seemingly endless plains. The Spanish found them formidable, adaptive, and impossible to permanently subdue. In the northeast, in the river systems of what is now Misiones and Corrientes, lived the Guaraní peoples. They practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, grew crops like maize and cassava, and lived in communal longhouses. The Jesuit missionaries who arrived in the 1600s would build their famous missions among the Guaraní, creating communities that lasted for over a century. And in Patagonia, in the far south, lived the Mapuche and the Tehuelche. The Mapuche were actually expanding eastward from Chile when the Spanish arrived, and they would remain unconquered until the late 1800s. The Tehuelche were the tall peoples of the south, who fascinated European explorers with their height and their adaptation to one of the harshest environments on Earth. Here's what's crucial to understand about the genetic story. Argentina's indigenous population was much smaller and more dispersed than Mexico's or Peru's. Estimates suggest that when the Spanish arrived, perhaps 300,000 to 500,000 indigenous people lived across the entire territory of modern Argentina. Compare that to Mexico, where the Aztec Empire alone ruled over millions, or Peru, where the Incan Empire governed 10 to 12 million people. This population difference would have profound consequences for Argentina's genetic future. In Mexico and Peru, Spanish colonizers encountered massive indigenous populations that they conquered and incorporated. The result was extensive mestizaje, mixing between Spanish and indigenous peoples, creating the mestizo majority that defines those countries today. But in Argentina, the smaller indigenous population and the different style of colonization would create a different outcome. The genetic story of Argentina wouldn't be written primarily during the colonial period. It would be written later, much later, during a wave of immigration so massive that it would fundamentally transform who Argentinians were. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First came the Spanish. In 1516, a Spanish expedition, led by Juan Díaz de Solís, sailed up what they called the Rio de la Plata, the River of Silver. They were searching for a passage to the Pacific and for the legendary silver mountains that would make them rich. Solís never found his silver. He was killed by indigenous peoples shortly after landing. But his expedition set in motion the Spanish claim to the region. The Spanish founded Buenos Aires twice. The first attempt in 1536 failed spectacularly. The small settlement couldn't sustain itself. Food was scarce, the indigenous peoples were hostile. The colonists starved. Within 5 years, the survivors abandoned the site and fled upriver to Asunción in what is now Paraguay. But in 1580, the Spanish tried again. They founded Buenos Aires for the second time, and this time it stuck. Slowly, painfully, Spanish colonization of the region began. Here's what you need to understand about Spanish colonization in Argentina. It was nothing like the conquest of Mexico or Peru. There was no single dramatic military campaign that toppled an empire and delivered millions of subjects to Spanish rule. Instead, Spanish settlement in Argentina was slow, limited, and concentrated in specific areas. The Spanish established themselves most successfully in the northwest, where sedentary agricultural peoples were easier to incorporate into the colonial system. Cities like Córdoba, Salta, and Tucumán became centres of Spanish power. Here, the Spanish did mix with indigenous populations, creating a mestizo population, similar to what happened elsewhere in Spanish America. But Buenos Aires and the Pampas were different. The nomadic peoples of the plains couldn't be easily controlled. Spanish settlement remained limited to the city and its immediate surroundings. The vast interior remained beyond effective Spanish control for centuries. During the entire colonial period, from 1580 to 1810, the Spanish population in Argentina remained relatively small. Perhaps a few 100,000 people of Spanish descent lived in the territory by the time of independence. Some had mixed with indigenous populations, particularly in the northwest. Others remained largely unmixed, particularly in the cities. But here's the crucial point. When Argentina gained independence from Spain in 1816, it was still a relatively empty country in demographic terms. The total population of the new nation was perhaps 600,000 to 800,000 people. Buenos Aires itself had fewer than 50,000 inhabitants. The genetic foundation of modern Argentina was not laid during the colonial period. The Spanish contribution to modern Argentinian DNA exists, certainly. About 20 to 25% of modern Argentinian DNA comes from Iberian sources. But this isn't the dominant story. The dominant story, the story that would make Argentina genetically unique in Latin America, was about to begin. And it started with a decision by Argentina's leaders that would change everything. They decided Argentina needed more people, Europeans specifically, millions of them. The Great Immigration, how Argentina became Italian. In 1853, Argentina adopted a new constitution. Buried in Article 25 was a seemingly simple provision. The government would encourage European immigration. This wasn't unusual. Many countries in the Americas wanted more immigrants to develop their territories. But Argentina took this idea further than almost anyone else. Argentina's leaders, particularly Domingo Faustino Sarmiento and Juan Bautista Alberdi, explicitly believed that European immigration would civilize and improve Argentina. They wanted to make Argentina into a European nation in the Americas. They created policies to make this happen. Free passage across the Atlantic for immigrants, free land grants, assistance with settlement, protection of immigrant rights. And then, between 1880 and 1930, something extraordinary happened. 6 million Europeans crossed the Atlantic to Argentina. 6 million. To put that in perspective, Argentina's total population in 1880 was around 1.8 million people. The arriving Europeans didn't just supplement the existing population, they overwhelmed it numerically. They transformed Argentina's demographic composition completely. Where did these 6 million come from? The largest single group, by far, came from Italy. Approximately 2 million Italians immigrated to Argentina between 1880 and 1930. They came from all regions of Italy, but particularly from the impoverished south, Calabria, Campania, Sicily. They came from the north as well, Piedmont, Liguria, Veneto. They came because Italy was poor, land was scarce, and opportunity was limited. In Argentina, they heard, there was land, there was work, there was possibility. Giuseppe Moretti, the young Sicilian we met at the beginning, was one of those 2 million. He arrived with nothing and found work as a labourer building the new port facilities in Buenos Aires. He lived in a boarding house with 15 other Sicilian men, all of them sending money back to their families in Italy. He spoke only Sicilian dialect for his first 2 years in Argentina. But slowly, Giuseppe's life changed. He learned enough Spanish to get better jobs. He met a woman named Maria, also from Sicily, whose family had arrived 3 years earlier. They married in 1908 in a ceremony conducted in Italian by a priest who served the immigrant community. They had 5 children between 1909 and 1920. Those children grew up speaking Spanish at school and Sicilian at home. By the time Giuseppe's grandchildren were born in the 1930s and 1940s, they spoke only Spanish. The Sicilian was gone, replaced completely within 2 generations. Giuseppe's story was repeated 2 million times across Argentina, with minor variations. 2 million Italians arrived, settled, married, had children, and saw their children become Argentine. Their Italian heritage became a family memory rather than a living culture. The second largest group came from Spain. Approximately 1.5 million Spaniards arrived during the same period. They came primarily from Galicia in the northwest and from Andalusia in the south, regions where poverty drove emigration just as it did in Italy. But the immigration wasn't limited to Italians and Spaniards. Hundreds of thousands of French immigrants arrived. Germans established colonies in the south. British immigrants came to work on railroads and in business. Polish and Russian Jews fled persecution in Eastern Europe and found refuge in Argentina. Arabs from Syria and Lebanon, then part of the Ottoman Empire, established themselves as merchants. The diversity was remarkable. By 1914, on the eve of World War I, Buenos Aires had become one of the most immigrant-dominated cities on Earth. 51% of the city's population was foreign-born. 51%. Walk down the streets of Buenos Aires in 1914 and you'd hear Italian in every neighbourhood. Not just standard Italian, but the dialects of Naples, Sicily, Genoa. You'd hear Spanish from Galicia. You'd hear Yiddish, French, German, Arabic. The immigrants transformed Argentina economically. They built the railroads that opened up the Pampas. They established the agricultural systems that would make Argentina one of the world's great wheat and beef exporters. They built the factories of Buenos Aires. They established businesses, newspapers, social clubs, theatres. Italian immigrants created the tango, fusing African rhythms from Buenos Aires' small Afro-Argentine population with Italian musical traditions and the poetry of immigrant longing. And genetically, they transformed Argentina completely. These weren't small numbers of elite colonisers mixing with a large indigenous population, as had happened during the Spanish colonial period in Mexico or Peru. These were millions of European workers, farmers and labourers who came with their families, married within their communities or with other European immigrants, and had children. The genetic impact was overwhelming. In Buenos Aires and the surrounding Pampas region, the European genetic contribution reached 90% or higher. The city and its hinterland became, genetically speaking, a transplanted piece of southern Europe. But here's where the story gets interesting, where it becomes specifically about Italian DNA rather than just European DNA. Because even though Argentina was consciously trying to attract European immigrants of all kinds, the Italians dominated numerically. And this created a fascinating genetic outcome that most Argentinians didn't realise until DNA testing became common in the 21st century. The Spanish language survived and became Argentina's national language for several reasons. First, it was already the language of government, education and official business from the colonial period. Second, while Italians were the single largest group, Spanish and Italian immigrants together formed a combined majority, and Spanish was a common language between them. Third, the Argentine government actively promoted Spanish through the education system, insisting that immigrant children be educated in Spanish, even as their parents spoke Italian or other languages at home. But while the language remained Spanish, the genes were becoming Italian. When those 2 million Italian immigrants married and had children, they didn't just vanish into a Spanish genetic pool. They created families that were predominantly or entirely Italian genetically. An Italian man from Sicily married an Italian woman from Naples, and their children were genetically Italian even as they grew up speaking Spanish and thinking of themselves as Argentine. In neighbourhoods like La Boca in Buenos Aires, Italian dialects persisted for generations. Lunfardo, the distinctive slang of Buenos Aires, incorporated hundreds of Italian words. The food became Italian-influenced, pasta and pizza becoming national dishes. The hand gestures, the expressiveness, the cultural style all showed Italian influence. But for most of the 20th century, Argentinians didn't think of themselves as Italian. They thought of themselves as Argentine, or as European, or as Spanish. The Italian heritage was acknowledged in family stories, in the knowledge that great-grandparents came from Italy, but it wasn't central to national identity. Until the DNA tests arrived, and suddenly millions of Argentinians discovered what the genetic record had known all along. Argentina wasn't a Spanish nation that happened to have some Italian immigrants. Genetically speaking, Argentina was an Italian nation that happened to speak Spanish. When companies like 23 and Me and Ancestry DNA became available in Argentina in the 2000s, they revealed something that shocked the nation. Study after study, test after test, showed the same thing. Approximately 60% of Argentinians who took DNA tests showed primarily Italian ancestry. Not Spanish, Italian. In Buenos Aires and the central provinces, the percentage was even higher. 70 to 75% of people showed Italian genetic heritage as their dominant European component. Only 15 to 25% showed primarily Spanish ancestry. The rest showed other European backgrounds: French, German, British, Eastern European. Some families went digging through old documents and discovered what their great-grandparents had never emphasised: Yes, the family did come from Europe, but not from Spain as everyone assumed. From a small village in Campania, from Sicily, from Piedmont. The documents were there, the immigration records, the ship manifests. They'd just been forgotten, or simplified, into "we came from Europe." The genetic studies that followed confirmed what individual tests were showing. A comprehensive study examining Argentinian genetic structure found that in the greater Buenos Aires region, European ancestry averaged around 90% of total DNA. Of that 90% European component, approximately 65% showed Southern European origins, consistent with Italian ancestry. 20% showed Iberian origins, consistent with Spanish ancestry, and 15% showed other European sources. The regional variation told an even more interesting story. In the northwest provinces like Salta, Jujuy and Tucumán, where Spanish colonization had been strongest and where mixing with indigenous populations had been more common during the colonial period, the genetic picture was different. Spanish ancestry was higher, sometimes the dominant European component. Indigenous ancestry was much higher, sometimes reaching 40 to 50% of total DNA. These regions look genetically more like other parts of Latin America. But in Buenos Aires, in the Pampas provinces, in the central regions where the great immigration wave had its strongest impact, the Italian genetic dominance was undeniable. Argentina hadn't just received Italian immigrants, it had become, genetically, an Italian population. Why had this been invisible for so long? Why had Argentinians thought of themselves as Spanish or generically European rather than specifically Italian? Part of the answer lies in language. Speaking Spanish every day, being educated in Spanish, consuming media in Spanish, all of this created a cultural identity that felt Spanish influenced even when the genetics told a different story. Part of the answer lies in the way immigration was remembered. Many families simplified their stories. "We came from Europe" became "we came from Spain," because Spain was the colonial power, the obvious reference point for European heritage in Argentina. And part of the answer lies in the way national identity works. Being Argentine meant something specific, something distinct from being Italian or Spanish. The Italian immigrants didn't see themselves as creating an Italian colony. They saw themselves as becoming Argentine, as building a new nation. Their children and grandchildren identified as Argentine first, and their European heritage became a family story rather than a living identity. But the DNA revealed the truth that had been there all along. The majority of modern Argentinians carry the genetic heritage of Italian farmers and workers who crossed the Atlantic more than a century ago, searching for a better life in a land they'd heard had space and opportunity. The uncomfortable question: where did the indigenous DNA go? There's another story in Argentinian DNA that's harder to celebrate, a story that makes many Argentinians uncomfortable when they confront it. If Argentina had hundreds of thousands of indigenous people when the Spanish arrived, and if the country now shows only about 8 to 10% indigenous DNA on average, what happened to the rest? The answer involves both disease and deliberate policy, and it's a story Argentina has only recently begun to confront openly. First came disease. As happened throughout the Americas, indigenous populations were devastated by European diseases to which they had no immunity: smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. These epidemics killed massive numbers of indigenous people throughout the colonial period. This was true in Argentina, as it was in Mexico, Peru, and North America. But disease doesn't fully explain the genetic outcome in Argentina, because indigenous populations elsewhere in the Americas survived and remained demographically significant. The second part of the answer is harder, darker, and involves deliberate government policy in the late 19th century. As Argentina was opening its doors to European immigration, it was simultaneously conducting military campaigns to eliminate indigenous populations, particularly in Patagonia and the Pampas. The most infamous of these was called the Conquest of the Desert, conducted primarily between 1878 and 1885 under the leadership of General Julio Argentino Roca. Despite its name, this wasn't a campaign against the desert. It was a campaign against the Mapuche and other indigenous peoples who controlled Patagonia and parts of the Pampas. The Argentine military used modern weapons to destroy indigenous communities, kill resistors, and force survivors onto marginal lands or into forced labour. The stated goal was to open up these lands for European settlement and agricultural development. The unstated goal was to eliminate indigenous peoples as a presence in Argentina, to make Argentina fully European in a way that Mexico or Peru could never be, because of their large indigenous populations. The genetic legacy of this history is visible in modern DNA tests. In Buenos Aires and the central provinces, the regions most affected by European immigration and most thoroughly cleared of indigenous populations, indigenous DNA averages only around 5%. But in the northwest provinces, the regions where indigenous populations were larger and where Spanish colonial mixing had created mestizo populations before the Great European Immigration, indigenous DNA can reach 40 to 50% of the total. This means that Argentina's genetic story isn't uniform across the country. There isn't one Argentinian DNA profile. There are regional profiles that reflect different histories. Buenos Aires looks like Italy. The northwest looks more like Bolivia or Peru. Patagonia, emptied of its indigenous population in the late 1800s and then settled by European immigrants, looks European again, but with scattered pockets of surviving indigenous communities showing much higher indigenous ancestry. Modern Argentinians are beginning to reckon with this history. DNA tests that reveal small percentages of indigenous ancestry, 5 or 10%, often lead people to ask questions about family stories they'd never heard, about great-great-grandmothers who were Mapuche or Guaraní, but whose indigenous heritage was hidden or minimised by families trying to appear fully European in a society that valued European identity. Giuseppe Moretti died in Buenos Aires in 1952 at the age of 70. He never returned to Sicily. He never learnt to read or write. But he raised 5 children who all finished school, who all spoke perfect Spanish, who all considered themselves completely Argentine. His grandchildren became teachers, shop owners, office workers. His great-grandchildren went to university. His great-great-grandchildren don't know where Sicily is on a map. But they carry his genes. 68% of their DNA comes from southern Italy, from the village outside Palermo where Giuseppe was born. The DNA remembers what the family forgot. So what does it mean to be Argentinian in the age of DNA testing? What does it mean to discover you're 65% Italian when you've spoken Spanish your entire life and thought of yourself as the descendant of Spanish colonizers? For some Argentinians, the DNA revelations have triggered a renewed interest in Italian heritage. People are learning Italian, travelling to the specific regions their great-grandparents came from, researching family histories that had been simplified or forgotten. Italian citizenship requests from Argentinians have surged because Italian law allows descendants of Italian citizens to claim citizenship. For others, the DNA results have reinforced something they already felt. Argentina was never quite Latin American in the way Mexico or Peru or Brazil were Latin American. The culture felt different. The population looked different. The historical experience was different. The DNA simply confirmed that difference and explained it. Argentina is European because Argentinians are, genetically, overwhelmingly European. And now, in the age of DNA, Argentinians are discovering that their national story is even more complex than they thought. They're not Spanish. They're not quite Italian either, despite the genes. They're not fully Latin American, but they're not European anymore. They're Argentine, a nation built by millions of immigrants from Italy, Spain, France, Germany, Poland, Syria, and elsewhere. A nation that speaks Spanish, but gestures in Italian. A nation that looks European, but exists in South America. A nation whose DNA tells a story of massive demographic transformation, of millions of people like Giuseppe crossing an ocean to build something new. The DNA reveals where Argentinians came from, but it doesn't answer the more interesting question: what did they become? And the answer, visible in every neighbourhood of Buenos Aires, audible in every accent of Argentine Spanish, present in every family gathering where Italian food is served and Spanish is spoken, and both are simply understood as Argentine. The answer is this: they became themselves.